She waited in the little dockside café where their story had started, the rain washing the smell of salt and wood smoke together with the scent of his jacket, and when he walked in holding another woman by the hand, the word he said hit like a thrown stone and broke everything. The town of Gray Marsh held its breath around them, an old pack town of narrow alleys and the Pax Alpha Hall, where vows and rules and claims had more weight than law. And in that suspended second, she lost not just the man who had promised her tomorrow, but the ground under her feet. Left pregnant and alone, the only one who could help her was the Alpha she had been taught to avoid, the Alpha whose name had been a warning whispered by her mother. This is a story of a faded bond, of a claim flung back into the mud, of old rituals and new promises, and today you will find out why the blessing that once tied hearts together could be unmade and remade, why an elder's law could betray the very thing it was meant to protect, and how a single scent could decide who deserved to stay. Stay until the end, because the last part will change everything. She had come to the cafe in a dress she swore she would never wear again, clutching a small pendant his grandmother had given her the first winter they slept under the same roof. And when he smiled at the woman with the bright laugh, she felt the pendant burn in her palm with the heat of every memory she had. "You lied to me," she said, simple and small. He blinked as if the words were a blade he had not expected. "It is not what you think," he began, and the way he said it cinched the dying hope in her throat until even the sound of her own breathing felt foreign. Around them, people glanced but did not come closer. The pack watched, because packs always watched. Names drifted across the wooden tables like ghosts: Mara the healer, Jonas the dockhand, Elder Cade, Senna the baker, Rowan the Alpha second, each of them carrying a little decision, a quiet reaction that would ripple into the ceremony hall and beyond. At the bar, Mara placed a hand over her mouth. Jonas folded his arms and looked away. Elder Cade tightened his jaw. Senna wiped a plate too slowly. Rowan's eyes flicked with something unreadable. The town sensed a fracture in the law of scent, and scent had always been the truest proof. Her scent had been his for a year and a half, faded only when he had stopped showing up. Now she found out that the rules that governed claiming and mating could be bent by greed and fear, and so her life narrowed to one urgent requirement: keep the child alive, keep the bloodline safe, and somehow find the courage to ask help from an Alpha whose name her father had spat like a curse. Her name was Lila. She was 32, freshly hollowed by betrayal, but steady in ways measured by slow breaths and the careful tying of her hair. Her backstory sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. She had been a child who learned to count storms because her father left during one when she was 8 and never came back. She had been a teenager who worked the docks with calloused hands and a child's fierce vow to never be abandoned again. She had met Tomas when he began buying fish in the early morning and laughing at her bad coffee. He was the soft patch in a life that had known too much wind. When she found out she was pregnant, she had thought the future belonged to them both. She had not planned to become a mother alone. She had not planned to need an Alpha to protect what she carried. But fate, the pack, and the old laws of claiming had other plans. Tomas's backstory was not empty either. He had been raised to be a second son, to take care of a small shop and the shop's ledgers, to marry comfortably and never to break the house. He had carried shame about a debt that had nothing to do with Lila, and he had been offered a bargain by a woman whose family had ways of offsetting ruin. The woman had scent money, men with claim in their blood, and a willingness to use the ritual of Pax Alpha to make what she wanted appear lawful. When Lila confronted Tomas at the cafe, the dialogue kept unfolding like a wound being probed. "Why her?" Lila asked. "You promised," she added, the repetition reinforcing itself until it was all she could hold. Tomas said, "It was protection, Lila, not betrayal." "Protection that needed a ring and a public claiming," Lila shot back. "You told me you would never let me raise a child alone." "I meant," he began, and then he stopped because the word would not fit the space he had made with his lies. The pack murmur grew. "This is between you and me," he insisted, but his voice lacked claim. Rowan, the Alpha's second, who was at the table with a map of the pack's Alpha ceremonies staying open on his phone, leaned in and said softly, "Public matters always become pack matters." That small phrase was a thunderclap. The negative, immediate conflict crushed Lila into motion. In a matter of hours, the town knew, as towns do, and names were aligned as if preparing for battle. "She is with child," someone said, and another voice supplied the name of the woman at Tomas's arm. Elise. Elise, who smelled of jasmine and silver threads, who had the polish and the eyes of someone born with a pendant and not with a hunger. The pack responded. Mara the healer offered herbal salves and watched Lila's hands like a mother scoping a future wound. Jonas the dockhand brought extra fish and put his hand on her back without speaking. Elder Cade sent a messenger with the formal language of disappointment. Sina baked bread and left it in a bag with a note that said, "You are not alone." Yet the worst reaction was not the whispers, but the formal notice from the pack's Alpha elder. A ritual hearing would be scheduled because claims made in public could affect lineage and rights to the pack's storehouses and shelter. Lila had to face a ritual she had never imagined attending as a defendant. That collapsing of hope gave weight to every sensory detail around her. She could smell the rain in the wood of the café, the acid tang of coffee, the faint scent of the pendant warmed by her palm. She could feel the pendant's cool metal beneath the cloth of her dress, the fabric rough where she had twisted it into her fingers. The sound of the bell at the hall door was a punctuation to a sentence she had not wanted read aloud. In the quiet of her apartment that night, the light was the wrong color, and the kettle hummed like something alive and weary. She lifted her hand to her belly and imagined the child as a rhythm she could not yet name. The backstory expanded there, in domestic scenes. She had learned to be steady, to feed a house with her hands alone, to make small triumphs out of burned bread. Her past braided into her present and made the isolation sting. She felt people look at her differently. Children at the market gave her space, as if they could sense a different scent, a something that said, "Keep away." The old law of the pack insisted on order. Claimings and matings were public because scent proved truth, but scent could be tampered with. It took only one person with knowledge of ancient charms to make a wrong scent read as right, and once the scent belonged to the wrong person, the consequences echoed. The town's response named 5 to 8 figures who would move the story forward. Elder Cade convened a council and called Rowan to account. Mara prepared a health check and arranged for quiet lodging should Lila need to rest. Jonas promised to act as witness to certain nights. Sina organized women to watch Lila's house, to bring stew and company. Father Bren of the Pack's Hall, the functional priest of the pack, read from the old scrolls and felt the weight of precedent lean into his hands. Each voice contributed to the community chorus that would decide whether the child inside Lila would be recognized by law and pack. The ceremony, when it came, was both a public spectacle and the beginning of a new reckoning. The event that catalyzed the whole thing was the Pack Alpha's Claiming Night, a ritual they called the Calling of the Bond, a ceremony that smelled of time, burned sage, and old books. Lila had intended to stay home, but the pack insisted. The hall was an echoing, amber room full of faces and the scent of candle wax and robes. There were banners for the Alpha, symbols of lineage, and at the entrance the new rival stood like a sun. Elise was beautiful and composed, and knew how to stand in the hall so that her scent carried perfectly. The rival's entry drew gasps and murmurs. The crowd shifted like a sea of leaves. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs, but when the elder placed a formal question before Tomas, he answered with words that had been practiced. "I claim my mate," he said, and the phrase fell heavy and final. The community reacted with procedural motions and a public humiliation so sharp it felt like knives beneath the skin. "You cannot claim two," Father Bren said, voice low and ceremonial. Tomas replied, I am the one who chooses. Not in our law, Elder Cod countered. The layout of the ritual required witnesses, signatures, a scent reading, and a blessing if the claim was sincere. Leela watched as a scent device was passed, a small bowl of herbs and oyster shells, the ancient procedure that a curandera had shown her once. The ritual was public, and therefore irreversible unless a counter was lodged within 7 nights. The hall became a courtroom where every look, every cough, every motion was a verdict. The humiliation was not a shout, but a tight series of public questions that made her husband's choice appear to be a thing of design, rather than the mistake she had hoped it was. After the ritual, the pack divided itself like a river splitting around a rock. Some offered Leela quiet support, others offered etiquette about propriety and caution about making waves. Then came an offer she could not refuse, and a choice she had not wanted to make. In the immediate fallout, an arrangement was proposed. The Alpha she had been taught to avoid, Alpha Calder, son of a line of stern men and long memory, approached with a solution carved out of necessity and the old compulsion to maintain order. He was rumored to be cold, a leader who kept distance, a man with a scent like winter and cedar that made the air around him feel disciplined. His name had been spoken in her childhood with a shorthand, Avoid. He had a backstory of his own, one marked by sacrifice, in the ways pack politics demanded. He had lost a brother in a claim fight when he was young, and the ghost of that loss kept him watchful and unyielding. Yet in the quiet of his office, which smelled of old books, ink, and a faint trace of smoke, he offered Leela a bargain. I will protect your child, he said. But there. Rules. They were not the rules she had wanted, but the pack lived by rules, and sometimes protection came with a price. The deal was simple on paper and complicated in the soul. Calder would register the child under the pack's protection, his house would provide shelter until the child was old enough to stand, and in return, Lila would accept a temporary arrangement that placed the child under the Alpha's name for legal matters. It was, in the way things sometimes are, both saving grace and claim. The tension of choice poisoned her nights. She weighed honor against survival, the duty to the child against the pride that had kept her upright. I will not be property, she told Calder at their first private meeting. He answered, You will be under my protection. That is not property. That is an order of survival for the pack. The agreement forced intimate contact, and with intimacy came complications. The scenes that followed were intimate without romance at first, necessity dictating proximity. Calder's home smelled of cedar, polished wood, and distant rain. The ritual aspects of the arrangement were explained precisely because in this world, even a protective act required process. The claiming ritual they used to register the child would involve a blessing by Father Bren and a scent confirmation by Mara, a marking of the pendant passed from grandmother to child with an elder's consent, and a signet stamped into the pack ledger. The procedure was a short, technical account that felt like armor. The blessing required an hour of preparation, 3 herbs ground into a paste, a circle burned into the air with incense, and 2 witnesses sworn to silence until the reading. The details stripped the moment of romance and gave it the texture of law. Living with Calder was like learning a new language of small rules. He was not cruel. He was precise, and the bed smelled faintly of cedar and soap. He taught her how the claim would protect the child's rights, and how, for the first 3 months, the pack would watch their household as a matter of course. In private, he was not the monster the stories promised. He had a humor that came out rare and soft. He also had a way of touching her hair like a man measuring the sincerity of weather. The intimacy that grew was complicated. Qualifies, like a vine growing where there should be flowers, and roots bound with barbed wire. At times, she found herself leaning into him for practical reasons, and the scent that wrapped around him began to matter in a way she had forbidden herself to admit. You are guarded, she said one night, the words half accusation, half observation. I could say the same to you, he replied. Their dialogue, expanded because every step forward required negotiation, became the core of a strange, slow romance. There were 10 exchanges during certain scenes, sometimes more, where they argued about small things, like who bought milk, and larger things like the language of titles and whose name the child would carry. Each exchange layered them with a sense of reluctant companionship, but the peace was brittle. In the middle of a slow building of trust, the twist arrived, and the story darkened. A mage, a peripheral figure in pack myth who sold favors and charms, had been invoked by Elise's family to alter scent readings. The revelation came from Mara, who had been with Lila in the clinic and had found traces of a charm under the skin when she examined a bracelet Elise had worn in the claiming. That discovery was a rupture that read like a conspiracy in slow motion. "She is altered," Mara said, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "They used a scent charm. It binds a reading for 7 nights." The accusation detonated in the pack square. Tomas did not answer. Elise's cheeks paled. The community demanded answers, and the accusation of magical interference made the scandal worse because it implied premeditation. The town's reaction led to a private investigation, a searching of pockets and hair, and the careful unspooling of timelines. Lila and Calder worked together, the reluctant allies now sharing information, preparing for a confrontation. They interviewed witnesses, traced tradesmen who had sold exotic incense, and slowly uncovered the threads that linked Elise to a merchant who had known Tomas's debts. The uncovering scenes had sensory detail: the smell of burnt sage on a vendor's hands, the metallic tang of coins exchanged in a shadowed alley, the way Elise's laughter had once tasted sweet and then turned to sugar left on the tongue too long. The revelations culminated in a tense discovery where Lila and Calder found a small vial hidden beneath Elise's pendant. The vial, warm with residual oil that carried a scent Lila recognized as a mimicry of Tomas's signature musk. The scene of the reveal demanded long, tight paragraphs and parried dialogue to make the betrayal land. "You set me up," Lila hissed. "I had to," Elise replied, with a brittle honesty that made the hurt more jagged. "My family needed security." The scenes of accusation were long and inflammatory. The couple of tense paragraphs describing their confrontation were expanded to allow the reader to feel every membrane of emotion. Lila's chest tightened, memory after memory catching into an ember. The smell of his shirt at the back of her closet, the way his laugh had once unfurled quietly at the end of a boat day. Then the book turned toward the central betrayal, one that could not be unstitched with proof alone. Tomas had not only been part of a scheme, he had chosen to remain silent when he could have stopped it. The pain of that made his face gray and unstable. "I did it for safety," he told them once when the pack demanded truth. His words were met with the pack's law, which wrestled with the idea of mercy. The pack could condemn or could forgive, but Lila's forgiveness was not demanded by law. It would be earned, if earned at all. The crisis that followed stretched into a dramatic confrontation, where whether the mage's charm could be reversed became a question of life and law. The mage, known only as Sekri, agreed to come under the watch of Elder Cade to perform a reversal, if compensated, and if the pack allowed it. The technical procedure Sekri described made the hair at the back of Lila's neck stand up. A counter chant over 3 cycles, an offering of herbs, and a sigil burned at dawn, a physical contact with the charm that required local anesthesia because it had been a subtle insertion of oil beneath the skin. The process itself was described with careful accessibility and credibility. A poultice, a steady hand, a whispered formula in a language older than the pack's written codes. Sekri agreed to the reversal provided there was a guarantee of safety and a deposit that Tomas's family could not fully pay without upsetting pack balance. This transactional nature of magic exposed the corruption deeper than any scent. The reversal began with the ritual described in procedural detail. Mara mixed rue and lavender into a thick salve. Father Bren held the circle steady and invoked the blessings. 3 witnesses were sworn to silence, and Calder and Lila sat with their hands clasped over a small bowl of water and salt. The counter-ritual smelled of iron and herbs and equal parts fear. The charm came away with a small pop and a smell like burned sugar. Thomas's breath hitched as something inside him shifted. The scent reading, once clear, returned, and the pack recognized the forgery. The reaction was immediate. Thomas was ostracized in certain ways, and he sought out Lila with apologies that came too late. The real twist, however, was larger. Sakri revealed that the charm had been not only a trick to deceive the scent reading, but part of an old grudge against the pack's alpha line. The rival family had sought to sow discord in the alpha line by producing a claim that would force the alpha to choose. Would the pack side with law or with compassion? Suddenly, the story was not only personal, but political. Calder found himself pulled into a decision about the very structure of his pack. Rows of villagers gathered at the hall. Father Bren read a passage about precedent and lineage. Elder Cade argued for a demonstration of new protocols for stricter surveillance of charms. Jonas, who had been at the docks his whole life, stood up and asked a simple question about justice that made everyone reconsider the human cost of rules. "Are we a pack that protects children or a pack that preserves image?" he asked. That line landed like lightning. Confrontation mounted toward the end. The climax came when Elise's family attempted to use the social ostracism of Lila to force Thomas back by threatening a public scandal that would affect his shop and his ability to provide. Lila would not be cowed. The pack turned into a courtroom and an arena simultaneously. The final confrontation was long and layered and included a rescue sequence when Thomas tried to flee town one night with his head bowed and a bag of coins. Jonas and Rowan intercepted him at the docks. There was a sharp collision, a scuffle, the scrape of wood, and the cold bite of sea air. Lila found Thomas there, hands empty of courage. "You will not leave your child without a name," she said. The rawness of that decisiveness was the moment he finally understood his failure. He did not fight back. The pack convened, and the verdict came down like a measured blow. Thomas would be banished from certain pack privileges until he could demonstrate restitution. He would be a secondary, his rights curtailed, and for a long time he would not be allowed to make legal claim upon the child's status. Calder moved to formalize the child's protection, and the community rallied, though not all were satisfied. There were scenes of high emotion following the verdict. Lila stood on the steps of the pack's hall as people argued like wind, and she found herself thinking of her father's absence with a new clarity. She realized that being forsaken had taught her a strange kind of strength, the will to continue despite fear. She chose to protect the child above all, even if it meant giving Calder an unusual place in the child's life. That choice was a seed for growth in both of them. The resolution was not a tidy marriage or a sudden happy ending. It was instead a negotiated peace. Calder did not announce himself as mate with a bite or a mark. Instead, he offered steady presence and a promise he intended to keep. They formed an arrangement that was part legal, part familial, and part something undefinable. In their private moments, they argued, fought, and sometimes laughed in a way that was learning to be human again. The community's reactions softened over weeks as the child's presence, once known and then sheltered, became simply part of the pack's life. Names that had been weapons became warm. Mara's offered herbal dinners became weekly. Jonas's pragmatic presence became a kind of friendship. Father Bren's blessings became quieter and more personal. The town adjusted its rituals too. Elder Cade helped draft a new rule about scent charms and public sealing of claims. It did not erase pain, but it gave the community a practical path. In the final conflict resolution, Calder confronted his own lineage. Halfway through this, he uncovered hidden grief about his brother and the reason he had been stern with law. He believed order prevented loss. Facing the truth opened him, allowing him to accept the messy tenderness that Leela offered without strings. there was still a betrayal to reconcile. Tomas had to ask forgiveness and to earn a place. He did menial work around the pack. He attended mandated counseling sessions with Father Bren. He wrote letters to the child that Leela kept in a drawer and read aloud sometimes when the nights were long. The narrative did not skip the small human things. Nighttime feedings that Leela navigated alone at first, then with Mara's careful help. The way Calder learned to hold a bouncing infant, and how awkward his hands looked when he tried. The scent of baby skin, new and clean and raw, that rewrote every sense of belonging in the hall. The epilogue then unspooled in measured, hopeful stages, because endings in packs were always measured against time. 1 month later, Leela stood in the little garden behind Calder's house and watched the baby sleep in a cradle that had once belonged to Calder's sister. The town had been kinder. Jonas had painted the swing set, and Mara had knitted a blanket. The child, whose name they had decided together as a compromise between family traditions, slept with the pendant pressed against her small chest. Leela felt the weight of protection slowly transform into a fragile peace. 1 month carried relief and new worries. Leela and Calder had not become lovers in a single beat. They had started to trust. They had long, practical conversations about schooling, about lineage, about what it meant to be raised under the watch of an alpha. They fell into the rhythm of parenting where small chores and midnight feeding created a gentle map of togetherness. 3 months later, the child's laugh filled the kitchen, where once only silence had been louder. Tomas had come to help with repairs, and sometimes saw the child through a window while he mended a fence. The pack recognized the child publicly, a small ceremony with Father Bren and Mara, an official ledger entry that gave the child rights and protections. In the public eye, the power of truth had reclaimed the pack's authority. The community had instituted a new protocol. Any scent claim must be corroborated by 3 independent witnesses and a curandera reading for 7 nights. The rule change felt like a small revolution, and Leela found herself standing in council meetings, voice steady, reminding men and women that the law should hold compassion as high as precedent. 6 months later, life had settled into a more durable shape. Calder walked the town at his normal pace, and Leela walked beside him, sometimes because they had created a bond that had nothing to do with bite or mark, but with mutual labor. The child toddled between them, and sometimes Calder would pick a raspberry from the market stall and feed it to the child, his hand softened in a way Leela had only once imagined. Tomas remained distant but present in tiny ways, offering here a piece of information about legalities or fixing a gutter. The pack had changed. The arch of its laws had become more flexible, and Elder Cade accepted that change with a rueful, private smile. The community had learned to name the mage problem out loud, to keep watch against charms and against the old arrogance that favored lineage over life. Lila had found something shifting inside her too. She had not expected to like Calder in the way some books promised. Instead, she found the safety of him to be a peculiar warmth that carried a steady hand and a willingness to make space. They did not fall in love all at once. They grew into a fierce affection built on shared responsibility and late-night conversations. Once, after a storm, Calder helped her on the porch and said softly, "You chose to trust me with the most important thing in the world." Lila answered, "I chose to trust you because you protected her." The sentence repeated, became an anchor, and when the town sent a small gift to celebrate the child's first festival, the community cheered for the family as a symbol of the pack's resilience. There were smaller scenes throughout that reinforced the themes of duty and desire, from Mara teaching Lila how to make a salve to Jonas and Senna arranging a communal table for harvest where the child was the center of a circle. The narrative included technical scenes like the ritual reversal and the formal registry details to keep credibility intact, but it also lingered in sensory moments, the leather of Calder's hand on a cradle, the scent of bread baking on slow mornings, the mingling of baby lotion and cedar by the hearth. The story asked the weighty questions that kept the audience thinking. What does it mean to choose safety over love? When is a law protecting children, and when is it protecting power? Who really has the right to name a future? At about a third of the way through this tale, when Lila realized that she would have to ask the alpha for help despite every childhood instinct screaming not to, the community moment arrived that asked the audience to engage. Imagine being in her place, empty and frightened, and creating a life in the space left by betrayal. Imagine waking up and smelling the ghost of a partner you loved and deciding whether to protect the child or to protect your pride. What would you do if you discovered your partner was not who he said he was? Would you choose to protect or to walk away? Reply protect if you would stand and shield the child and follow that with why in a few honest words. Reply walk away if you would rather keep yourself whole and explain your reason briefly. Share your choice because your voice helps others who might be in the same storm, and because this community learns by stories and decisions. Your comment might guide a future episode and help someone else decide their path. Now that you have shared, let us return to the story and see what the pack chooses next. The CTA to subscribe came later, at a soft moment, after a small, tender scene where Calder and Leela rocked the baby by the window. If this story moved you, subscribe. Here we tell stories of lost promises, of ritual and redemption, of packs that change and people who try to refuse the roles they were given. Subscribe so you do not miss how this family rebuilds, and so you can be part of a community that thinks through the hard choices with empathy and fierceness. The final chapters closed with a conclusion that held both consequence and hope. Leela had lost the life she imagined, but she had not lost the choice to love again. The pack adjusted its rules, adding protections against charms and creating a registry where every claim was checked by 3 witnesses and a curandera reading. Elders amended the law so that compassion and safety were named explicitly as reasons to override tradition. Leela chose to protect the child no matter what the cost, and in doing so, she formed an unexpected alliance with Calder that became, in time, the family's backbone. The consequences were concrete. Tomas kept community service and made public amends. Elise left town shamed, but repentant. Elise's family faced sanctions that stripped them of certain privileges. The epilogue in 3 moments sealed the story with time and change. 1 month later was a time of firsts and fragile promises. 3 months later, the pack had codified protections and Leela felt a cautious relief. 6 months later, the child was part of the town fabric, their laughter ordinary in the best possible way. And the pack moved forward with new rules to guard against the corruption of scent. The final image left was not of perfect healing, but of a road ahead, newly paved and walked together. If this account touched you, tell someone who needs to hear it. If it stirred a memory, share it in the comments and help our community learn and grow. Join us if you want to follow the family's next chapter. The last line returned to the first ache and reversed it into a promise. She had lost the life she imagined, but she had not lost the right to choose who would stand by her side. And in the shelter of that choice, she found the beginning of a future.